Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one I'll be talking about the upcoming Russian summer offensive. It has recently been stated by Vladimir Putin that the Russians are planning on creating a buffer zone along the Russo-Ukrainian border. This was not limited to the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, but instead the entirety of the border area from Bryansk to Chernihiv in the north to Belgorod and Kharkiv in the south. Now, this buffer zone idea is not a new one. It is one that has been talked about for over a year since the Ukrainians first started launching some incursions into the Russian side of the border. It has especially taken up the attention of the president of Russia since the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Now that the Russians have recaptured the Kursk region and they have also already entered Kharkiv prior to the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, we'll now be seeing the Russians taking into action what they've been talking about for a while, and that is likely to take place this summer. The Russians will continue their offensive operations within the Donetsk region, potentially expanding to the Kharkiv region here in the east and Zaporizhia in the south. However, in addition to that, the Russians will be launching some sort of operation around the border area between Russia and Ukraine to create a buffer zone. This is to prevent further Ukrainian incursions into Russian territory. It is also to create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side to prevent Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory. The majority of strikes takes place within 15 kilometers of the border area. This means a 15-kilometer deep border incursion by the Russians across the entire border would allow them to pretty much cancel out 90% of the Ukrainian strikes across the border. To give an idea about the distance between the Russian border and key Ukrainian positions, such as the cities of Sumy and Kharkiv, we can measure out the distance at closest points to these cities from the Russian border. Here in the Sumy direction, it is from around Goromel, and we can see that it is approximately half the distance between the Russian border and Sumy, a bit closer to Sumy itself. With this, we can see that the Russians would still be a decent amount of distance away from Sumy. At the same time, the Russians have continuously been launching strikes on Sumy. However, setting up positions just 15 kilometers away from the city will allow the Russians to significantly increase these strikes on it, and will limit the Ukrainian ability to conduct operations using Sumy as the center. Similarly, in Kharkiv, the closest point to the border area is around the highway here to the north, and we can see that is approximately half the distance from the city as well, where the Russians would be within close proximity to the city, which will allow them to launch artillery strikes, FPV drone strikes, and so on towards the city. Of course, the Ukrainians present within the city will also be able to strike back. However, the main objective of the Russians is to create a buffer zone and not to take control over the city, which would mean the Russians would look to, rather than stay present within this 15-kilometer border buffer zone, they'll instead advocate for just keeping it clear, have some few soldiers at the front line, and then create a buffer zone that is just completely empty of Ukrainian soldiers. That is the objective of the Russians for these operations. Now, there are two ways the Russians can go about this. One direction is to simply do a border-wide offensive, where they'll be looking to gain control over the border area with a 15-kilometer zone, where they'll just empty it out for Ukrainian soldiers, hold it on to their own control, and then set up some defensive positions, fortifications, and so on within this buffer zone, preventing the Ukrainians from entering into it. So if the Ukrainians in the future want to launch an operation, they'll not be entering into Russian territory, they'll instead be fighting over their own territory. The second way the Russians can do about this is doing it one region at a time, expanding their zone of control around the Kharkiv border area, then moving on to the Sumy region, and then finally into the Chernihiv region. This is a more step-by-step basis. Instead, I think the Russians will be working on a mix of both, where they'll be launching operations in parts of Chernihiv region, Sumy region, and Kharkiv region at the same time, where the objective will be to expand this buffer zone bit by bit in every single region independently from each other. And at the same time, they'll be working in some areas where they will be going deeper than simply the 15-kilometer buffer zone. I believe this is the case based on two parts. First off, militarily speaking, it makes more sense. Having your forces concentrated in one area gives you a militaristic advantage that is not possible by spreading your forces around a wide border area. The Ukrainians would be able to respond to one of them at a time, concentrating the majority of the forces in one direction, while only keeping enough forces to slow down the Russian advances in other directions, allowing them to launch an operation to kick out the Russian forces and then move on to the next target and continue doing so, all the classic defeat in detail that Napoleon was very competent at. So, based on this, we can see the Russians would have an interest in launching stronger operations in a smaller section of the front line, but at the same time, they wanted to create a wide buffer zone along the entire front line. So this is a bit of a contradiction. To solve this, they would need to launch deeper operations in some sections of the front line, and that is the second reason. If the Russians gain control over a wide area, for example, connecting Vovchansk in the northwest, here in the Kharkiv region, with Kupiansk in the east, they'll be able to secure along natural barriers and then move onwards to the next point, where they can slowly expand bit by bit within the Kharkiv region, and similarly doing it at other sections of the front line, such as the Sumy region and the Chernihiv region, will allow them to advance in some sectors of the front line beyond the 15 kilometers range, but creating it along the natural barriers will allow the Russians to hold on to the positions and then move on to the next one. This will be a more lengthy process, and the Ukrainians will be able to respond with full force, but the Russians can also concentrate their own forces in smaller sectors of the front line, where they can make full advantage of their superiority in numbers and firepower. Now that I have explained the specifics in terms of what I expect the Russians to do, we can look at specifics in terms of where they will do it. And if we take a look at the Kharkiv region, for example, we've seen that they have increased their activity within the Vovchansk direction, both in the northern parts of the town and to the east of it, over the recent weeks. The Russians have continued advancing within the town itself, where they've managed to gain control over much of the northern parts of it. There is a small part along the aggregate plant and the residential area here in the eastern parts of the northern part of the town that the Russians are attacking both flanks of by reaching the river line here to the west of it and the east of it. The Russians will look to gain full control over the river line, after which they can start operating either by continuing east along the Vovcha river line or by expanding beyond the river line into the southern parts of it and into the southern parts of Vovchansk. If the Russians gain control over the entire river line from the Russian side of the border and into the Ukrainian side and move across into Vovchansk and the fields here to the south of it, expanding into the highway direction, the Russians have several points from which they can enter from across the border area, and with their foothold across the Oska river line near the Varishna and Kupiansk, the Russians would be able to launch offensive operations to connect their forces from the west and from the east to gain control over a wide point of the border area. Russians would then look to expand along the Severodonetsk River beyond the 15-kilometer zone and move down towards having the Severodonetsk River as a western flank for their positions, and then aligning the front line with the highway. The Russians would be able to create a wide buffer zone area along the border between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. From this, they will have a shorter front line than the current one in the north, and will prevent the Ukrainians from launching strikes or operations into the Belgorod region here north of Kharkiv, from which they can continue expanding in a westward direction near Lipsy to gain control over Lipsy and some of these fortified positions. They can create a border zone there as well. There will be no natural barriers that they can take advantage of here to the north of Kharkiv. Therefore, the Russians would have to constantly have a presence here. However, with this buffer zone, they'll be able to have a wide front line along the Severodonetsk River, and they will have to significantly shorten the front line compared to what it currently is. and then move alongside to the north of the Kharkiv region. So you can see it'll be a step-by-step process: the east, then the center, and then the northwestern parts, where they will cover the defense of the border area by launching an incursion into the Ukrainian side of the border area. This also allowed the Russians to start offensive operations towards Izium in the south, along the Uska River line, where the objective would be to flank the Donetsk region. Clearing up the Donetsk region will free up a lot of Russian soldiers and allow the Russians to have a larger presence along the rest of the front line, because there will not be a lot more industrial, urban, and fortified positions that they have to cover, which requires a lot more soldiers than the open fields in the north. As for the Sumy region, we can see here that there is the forest patch area. If the Russians align the front line with this forest patch area, they'll be able to create a buffer zone along the border area that connects with the Ukrainian side, where there will be a presence, and the majority of fighting will be between infantry in the forest area, similar to the Srebrenytsky forest area south of Liman. This allowed the Russians to create a buffer zone where the fighting will be mainly infantry, allowing for armored vehicles to be used in other areas of the front line, such as the north of Sumy. And the Sumy region is the most difficult place for the Russian forces to have a buffer zone. In the Chernihiv region, it is fairly easy. There are several river lines and forest patches that the Russians can make use of along the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border. However, in the Sumy region, it is mostly open fields, especially in the area between the Sumy region and the Chernihiv region. There is this part here, which is practically just open fields. It's a lot of highways, it is well connected and close proximity towards Kiev. In general, the Ukrainians would have an easy time supplying the forces here and be able to concentrate larger forces in this section of the front line, while the Russians will have no natural barriers to make use of. Therefore, the logical explanation for the Russians to create a solid buffer zone across the border would be to actually take control over the city. There are two major military benefits to this. The first one is they'll be able to have a solid hold over the Sumy section of the border, allow them to launch offensive operations on a wider section of the front line to potentially gain full control over or large control over the Sumy region itself, to be able to use Sumy as a logistical hub. And it'll also open up the road between Sumy and Kiev. It'll weaken the eastern flank of Kiev and start a potential for a future Russian offensive towards the capital city of Ukraine. At the same time, with regards to Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Poltava, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, Sumy is not actually a large city. The population is approximately 200,000 people. It is a wide city with several different points. There is the apartment complex area on the eastern bank of the river line that goes through the central parts of it. There's industrial area in the southeast and in the northwest. And then the remaining parts are more suburban. Based on this, we can see that the city itself is not realistically much more difficult for the Russians to capture than Mariupol at the start of the war. In comparison, the Ukrainians have a lot more soldiers available today compared to back then. Also have a lot more experience. They have a shorter supply line. So there are several benefits for the Ukrainians in terms of defending the city. But as for the city itself, Mariupol was more difficult to fight over than Sumy is. Realistically, the Russians would need to encircle it, cut it off from supplies, and then gain control over it that way. And based on this, we can see that there is a new tactic that the Russians are using, as is explained by the Telegraph. What this current Russian tactic, the way it is explained, is that the Russians launch operations, mostly infantry and armored vehicles, where the Ukrainians would be forced to respond to such an operation. So they prepare, set up their positions, come out of their positions, their entrenchments, put up their ATGMs, launch their own operations with drones and artillery and so on to attack this Russian force that is storming the positions. At that point, the Russians start launching artillery barrages, launch drones, and strike the Ukrainian positions that are now out in the open, responding to the Russian offensive. This forces the Ukrainians to take a decision. Either they will launch a counterattack, set up their positions, continue fighting against the Russian offensive, and be vulnerable to this artillery barrage and drone strikes, or they will go back into their entrenchments, wait out this artillery barrage and drone strikes, and then fight the Russians when they are either within the town or much closer. This will allow the Russian soldiers and vehicles to move very close to the town without being shot at by the Ukrainian forces. And this puts the Ukrainians in the final dilemma, and that is, while they are going back into their entrenchments to survive the artillery and FPV drone strikes, the Russians will be attacking with FAB bombs, glide bombs. They'll be striking these entrenched positions, attacking the Ukrainians while they are entrenched. So we see that there's a three-step process. The Russians attack, which forces the Ukrainians to respond. The Ukrainians are still then have to choose between entrenching themselves or responding to the Russian attack. If they respond to the Russian attack, they'll be attacked by artillery and drones. If they entrench themselves, then the FAB bombs and glide bombs come in to strike their entrenchments. This means that there is no way for them to win. Every single response they have prepared, the Russians have an option to strike them and make the most of the situation. Based on this, we can see that the Ukrainians, although they have developed a lot of experience and developments making the most of what limited resources they have, it still does not change the fact that they do not have the necessary air defense, they do not have the necessary vehicles, they do not have the necessary fortified positions to deal with a large-scale Russian offensive, especially once to make use of all of the Russian weaponry, because the Russians simply have that much larger of a firepower advantage, and at the same time they now have a lot more manpower as well, which significantly outdoes what the Ukrainians have as a potential. In conclusion, we'll be expecting more Russian incursions into Ukrainian territory, both here in the Sumy region and wider Sumy region, both in the forest patches and the open fields. They'll launch several incursions into the Kharkiv region as well. In some areas, they'll go deeper, such as in the Kupiansk direction, in the direction of Izium, potentially launching an offensive towards Sumy itself. And all of this is not just possible, it is all likely to happen based on the statements on the Russian side and the Russian military capability as it stands right now. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out for Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day.